I never thought witnessing a confrontation between two of America's most senior generals would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Major David Patterson, and in the autumn of 1944, I was a 34-year-old operations officer assigned to the 12th Army Group headquarters under General Omar Bradley in France. I'd graduated from West Point in 1932, spent the peacetime years in various staff positions, and by 1944 had become one of Bradley's trusted planning officers, responsible for coordinating operations among the multiple armies under his command. My job required discretion, diplomatic skill, and the ability to navigate the enormous egos and complex personalities of senior commanders. But nothing in my training or experience prepared me for what happened on October 12, 1944, when Lieutenant General George Patton, commander of the Third Army, walked into Bradley's forward headquarters near Verdun and delivered a 30-minute tirade that exposed fundamental disagreements about strategy, command relationships, and the direction of the war. What made the incident truly extraordinary wasn't just Patton's volcanic anger or the substance of his complaints, but rather the systematic effort afterward to bury all evidence that the confrontation had occurred, an effort that succeeded so completely that the story remained classified for decades. The morning of October 12th started with routine preparations for a commanders' conference Bradley had called to discuss the stalled Allied advance toward Germany. By October 1944, the dramatic breakthroughs of the summer had given way to grinding attritional warfare as Allied armies pushed against increasingly desperate German resistance. Supply problems, autumn weather, and the Wehrmacht's surprisingly effective defense had slowed what many had hoped would be a decisive drive to end the war before Christmas. Bradley, as commander of the 12th Army Group, controlled multiple American armies, including Patton's Third Army, and the conference was meant to coordinate operations and address the strategic challenges we faced. I was in the operations room of Bradley's forward headquarters, a requisitioned French chateau about 10 miles behind the front lines, preparing briefing materials when Patton arrived. He was scheduled for 1,000 hours, but he showed up 30 minutes early, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Patton was never early to meetings he didn't want to attend, and his body language as he entered the building radiated barely controlled fury. "Where's Brad?" Patton demanded, not bothering with pleasantries or military courtesy. At 58 years old, Patton was one of the Army's most experienced and controversial commanders, known equally for his tactical brilliance and his volcanic temper. He was wearing his trademark riding boots and ivory-handled pistols, every inch the warrior general he cultivated in his public persona. "General Bradley is in his office, sir," I replied. "The conference isn't scheduled to begin for another 30 minutes. "I don't give a damn about the conference schedule," Patton snapped. "I need to talk to Brad now, alone." I should have insisted he wait, should have followed protocol and announced him properly, but the intensity of his anger was intimidating enough that I simply showed him to Bradley's office and quietly withdrew. What I didn't do was leave the building entirely. The walls in the old chateau were thin and I could hear voices from the adjacent room where I'd been working. What began as a conversation quickly escalated into one of the most explosive confrontations between senior Allied commanders during the entire war. Bradley's voice came first, calm and measured, as always. "George, what's this about? You look ready to tear someone's head off." "I am ready to tear someone's head off, and that someone is you," Patton replied, his voice already rising. "You're destroying my army with your goddamn caution and your obsession with maintaining a broad front. We had the Germans beat in August. We could have ended this war months ago, but instead you're spreading our forces thin across the entire front and achieving nothing anywhere." There was a pause. Then Bradley responded with that characteristic patience that had made him Eisenhower's most trusted subordinate. "George, we've been over this. Supreme Headquarters has determined that a broad front strategy minimizes risk and maintains pressure across the entire German defensive line. Your proposal for a single narrow thrust deep into Germany was evaluated and rejected as too risky." "Too risky?" Patton's voice was incredulous and furious. "What's risky is what we're doing now. We're giving the Germans time to reorganize, to build new defenses, to prepare for a winter campaign that's going to cost us thousands of casualties that could have been avoided if we'd kept up the momentum in September. My Third Army could be across the Rhine right now if you'd given me the supplies and support I needed, instead of spreading everything equally across Montgomery's front, and Hodges's front, and my front, until none of us have enough to accomplish anything decisive." I heard movement in the office, probably one of them standing or pacing. Bradley's voice remained level. You didn't have enough fuel to reach the Rhine in September. The logistics analysis was clear. Your advance would have outrun its supply lines and left your army isolated and vulnerable to German counterattack. That's not caution, George. That's military reality. Don't lecture me about military reality, Patton shot back. I've been fighting Germans since North Africa, while you were pushing papers at a desk. I know what my army can do, and I know what we could have achieved if we'd been given priority for supplies and been allowed to exploit the German collapse. Instead, Eisenhower listened to Montgomery's fantasies about Market Garden, gave him priority for supplies and watched him fail spectacularly, while my army sat on its ass, waiting for enough fuel to move forward. That's not strategy, Brad. That's political considerations taking precedence over military effectiveness. This was dangerous ground. Criticizing Supreme Headquarters decisions and suggesting they were motivated by politics rather than military judgment could be considered insubordination or worse. Bradley clearly recognized this because his next words carried a harder edge. General Patton, you need to control yourself. You're making allegations about Allied command decisions that are both inappropriate and inaccurate. Market Garden was a calculated risk that didn't achieve its objectives, but it was a legitimate strategic operation, not a political favor to Montgomery. And your characterization of Supreme Headquarters decision-making is offensive and out of line. You want to talk about out of line? Patton's voice was rising again. How about the fact that you're asking me to attend planning conferences at a headquarters that's 70 miles behind the front? How about the fact that you're running operations from a comfortable chateau while my soldiers are fighting and dying in the mud? How about the fact that you've become so obsessed with coordination and process that you've forgotten what war is actually about? War is about accomplishing strategic objectives while minimizing casualties and managing resources. Effectively, Bradley replied, his voice still controlled but with clear anger underneath. It's not about dramatic gestures and personal glory. You want to race across France like you're playing some kind of game. Consequences be damned. That's not leadership, George, that's ego. The silence that followed was deafening. When Patton spoke again, his voice was quiet but seething with rage. You think this is about ego? You think I'm advocating aggressive operations because I want glory? I've been fighting this war long enough to care more about ending it than about how history records my role. What I'm advocating is using our mobility and firepower advantages while we still have them, before the Germans dig in for winter and before we waste the sacrifices that got us this far. Every day you delay with your careful planning and your coordination conferences is a day the Germans use to prepare better defenses. Every week we sit in place because you're spreading supplies equally is a week closer to winter campaigns that will cost us casualties that aggressive action in September could have prevented. And what if your aggressive action had failed? Bradley countered. What if Third Army had advanced deep into Germany, run out of fuel as our logistics analysis predicted, and been cut off by German counterattacks? You'd have lost an entire army, created a disaster that could have prolonged the war for years, and gotten tens of thousands of soldiers killed or captured. That's the risk you're so casually dismissing. There's risk in any military operation, Patton said. The question is whether we take calculated risks that could produce decisive results, or whether we avoid all risk and accept grinding attritional warfare that we know will be costly. You're choosing the second option, and you're doing it because you're afraid of failure, afraid of taking responsibility for bold decisions, afraid that Eisenhower might question your judgment if something goes wrong. I heard something slam on a desk, probably Bradley's fist. When he spoke, the careful control was gone from his voice. Don't you dare question my courage or my commitment to this army. I've made decisions that sent thousands of men to their deaths. I've ordered operations knowing full well that they'd result in casualties. I don't sleep well at night thinking about those decisions, but I make them based on careful analysis, consultation with my staff, and consideration of all the factors involved. Not based on my gut feeling or my desire for dramatic victories. Maybe you should trust your gut more, Patton replied. Maybe you should remember that war is fundamentally about will and momentum, not about process and coordination. The Germans are beaten, Brad. They know they're beaten. But we're giving them time to recover because you're more comfortable managing a careful advance than exploiting a collapsing enemy. The Germans are not beaten, Bradley said flatly. They're desperate, which makes them dangerous. They're fighting on their own soil, which increases their determination, and they still have significant military capacity, which they're using effectively to slow our advance. Your assessment that they're simply collapsing and we just need to push harder is wrong. It's dangerously wrong, and it could get a lot of people killed if I allowed you to operate based on that mistaken assumption." What followed was a long pause, then Patton's voice, cold and formal. "General Bradley, I came here today to request that you approve Third Army's operational plan for an offensive toward the Saar. I've submitted the plan through proper channels, it's been reviewed by my staff and found operationally sound, and I'm requesting permission to execute it immediately. Your plan requires supply allocations that exceed what I can authorize given the needs of First Army and Ninth Army," Bradley replied, his voice returning to professional neutrality. "I've reviewed it. It's an excellent plan tactically, but we don't have the resources to support it while maintaining our positions across the entire front. I'm denying the request." "Then you're condemning Third Army to sitting in place while the Germans strengthen their defenses," Patton said. "You're wasting the combat effectiveness of your most aggressive and capable force because you're worried about maintaining balance across your command. That's not generalship. That's bureaucratic management." "That's my decision," Bradley said with finality. "You may disagree with it, but you'll follow it. Third Army will continue current operations, maintain pressure on German positions, and prepare for winter campaigns. You'll coordinate with First Army on your northern flank and support the broader Army group strategy. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear," Patton replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "I understand that Third Army is to remain subordinate to your operational timidity and that any initiative or aggressive action on my part will be constrained by your need to keep everything neat and coordinated. I understand that you've chosen to fight this war by committee rather than by taking the kind of risks that actually win decisive victories." "General Patton, you're dangerously close to insubordination," Bradley warned. "I've tolerated your criticism because we have history and because I know you're frustrated with the operational situation, but there are limits to what I'll accept, even from you. You'll follow my orders, you'll maintain military courtesy, and you'll keep your strategic disagreements within appropriate channels. If you can't do that, I'll have to consider whether you're fit to continue commanding Third Army." The threat hung in the air. Relieving Patton would be a massive step, one that would require Eisenhower's approval and would create significant political and military complications. But Bradley's voice carried enough steel to make clear he was serious. When Patton spoke again, his voice was controlled but still angry. "I'll follow your orders because that's my duty as a subordinate commander. But I'm putting on record that I believe those orders are wrong, that they're wasting opportunities that won't come again, and that they're prolonging this war unnecessarily. When historians look back at this period, they'll wonder why we stopped when we had the Germans beaten. And the answer will be that commanders like you chose caution over boldness, process over results, and committee decisions over individual initiative. Your objection is noted," Bradley said. "Now, are you staying for the commanders' conference, or are you leaving?" "I'm leaving," Patton replied. "I've said what I came to say, and I don't see any point in sitting through another planning session where you'll tell us all to coordinate our operations and maintain our positions while accomplishing nothing decisive. I'll send my Chief of Staff to represent Third Army." I heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly moved away, not wanting to be caught obviously eavesdropping. Patton emerged from Bradley's office, his face flushed with anger, and strode past me without acknowledgement. He left the building, climbed into his waiting jeep and departed in a spray of gravel from the driveway. Bradley emerged a moment later, saw me, and must have realized from my expression that I'd heard at least part of the confrontation. "Major Patterson, you'll forget everything you just heard. That conversation is not to be discussed, referenced, or included in any records or reports. Is that absolutely clear?" "Yes, sir," I replied immediately. "Completely clear." "I mean it, David," Bradley continued, using my first name in a rare break from formality. "What just happened was between General Patton and myself. It doesn't leave this building. George was blowing off steam, expressing frustrations that we all share to some degree. But if word got out that two senior American commanders were having that kind of disagreement, it would undermine confidence in Allied command unity and give ammunition to people who want to question our strategy. So it never happened. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Bradley nodded and returned to his office. I stood there trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The argument had exposed fundamental disagreements about how to fight the war, about the balance between caution and aggression, about whether Allied strategy was sound or wasteful. More troubling, it had revealed personal tensions between two of America's most senior commanders that went far beyond mere tactical disagreements. Over the following days, I watched as the evidence of Patton's visit was systematically eliminated. The appointment log was altered to show that Patton had cancelled his attendance at the commander's conference. The duty officer who'd logged Patton's arrival was quietly transferred to another unit. My own notes from that morning were confiscated and destroyed. Within a week, it was as if the confrontation had never occurred. The suppression effort extended beyond Bradley's headquarters. I later learned that Eisenhower's headquarters had issued guidance that any reports of friction between Bradley and Patton were to be investigated and quashed. The public narrative of Allied command unity was too important to allow stories of senior commanders' disagreements to circulate. The press, the troops, and the folks back home needed to believe that American generals were working in perfect harmony toward victory. The messy reality of personality conflicts, strategic disagreements, and bruised egos had to be hidden. What made the burial of the story particularly effective was that both Bradley and Patton had incentives to keep it quiet. Bradley didn't want his authority questioned, or to be seen as unable to control his subordinate commanders. Patton didn't want to risk being relieved for insubordination, or to be portrayed as a prima donna general who put his ego above the mission. So both men essentially agreed to pretend the confrontation had never happened, and everyone else who knew about it was ordered or encouraged to do the same. The strategic disagreements Patton had raised didn't disappear, though. The debate about broad front versus narrow thrust strategy continued throughout the autumn and winter of 1944, playing out in planning sessions and commanders' meetings and staff papers. Patton continued to advocate for aggressive operations and continued to be frustrated by what he saw as excessive caution from his superiors. Bradley continued to emphasize coordination and careful planning, believing that Patton's aggressive instincts needed to be tempered with realistic assessment of resources and risks. History has generally validated some of Patton's criticisms while also confirming some of Bradley's caution. The Allied advance did slow dramatically in autumn 1944, and opportunities for potentially decisive operations were probably missed. But Patton's assumption that the Germans were simply collapsing and could be pushed to complete defeat with one more aggressive thrust proved wrong. The Wehrmacht fought effectively through the winter, even launching the Ardennes offensive in December that temporarily threw Allied plans into chaos. Whether a more aggressive strategy in September would have ended the war earlier, or would have resulted in isolated American armies being destroyed by German counterattacks, remains one of the great unanswerable questions of World War II. I remained on Bradley's staff through the end of the war, eventually serving in occupied Germany during the post-war period. I never spoke about the October 12th confrontation during my military career, honoring Bradley's order and understanding the political reasons for keeping it quiet. But I never forgot it either, and I never fully resolved my own feelings about which general had been right. After retiring from the Army in 1952, I taught military history at a small college in Virginia. I watched as the first generation of World War II histories was published, most of them portraying Allied command relationships as harmonious and strategic decisions as the result of careful consensus building. The sanitized version of history that emerged bore little resemblance to the messy reality I'd witnessed, where strong-willed commanders disagreed fundamentally about how to fight the war, and where personality conflicts sometimes influenced strategy as much as rational analysis. The story of the October 12th confrontation remained classified until 1983, when declassification of wartime documents finally allowed historians to access records that had been suppressed for nearly 4 decades. Even then, the full story didn't emerge immediately. Many of the key participants were dead, including both Bradley and Patton. The surviving witnesses, like myself, had been conditioned for so long not to discuss it that breaking that silence was difficult. I finally wrote a detailed account in 1987, submitting it to the Army's Historical Division as part of an oral history project. The account was published in a scholarly journal with limited circulation, ensuring that it remained accessible primarily to military historians rather than becoming a popular story that might influence public perceptions of the war. Even decades after the events, there remained institutional reluctance to widely publicize evidence of serious disagreements among senior Allied commanders. What struck me in retrospect was how effectively the story had been buried and how long that burial persisted. October 12, 1944 was a significant moment that revealed genuine strategic disagreements and command tensions that influenced Allied operations for months afterward. but because it was politically inconvenient and potentially damaging to reputations and institutional interests, it was systematically erased from the historical record for decades. The commanders involved agreed to forget it. The witnesses were silenced. The documentary evidence was destroyed or classified, and the official histories ignored it entirely. This raises uncomfortable questions about how much of our understanding of World War II, or any war, is based on sanitized official narratives rather than messy reality. How many other confrontations, disagreements, and mistakes were similarly buried to protect reputations and maintain desired narratives? How much of military history is public relations rather than actual history? I'm 94 years old now, one of the last surviving witnesses to that confrontation between Bradley and Patton. When I tell younger people about it, they're often surprised that such fundamental disagreements existed among Allied commanders, that the unified front presented to the public was partly theatrical, and that important historical events were deliberately hidden from view for decades. They've grown up with a mythologized version of World War II, where American generals worked in perfect harmony, and strategic decisions were made purely on military merit, without personal or political considerations. The reality was far more complicated and human. My name is David Patterson, and I was 34 years old when I witnessed a confrontation that exposed the reality behind Allied command unity, and that the Army worked for decades to keep hidden. That experience taught me to be skeptical of official narratives, to recognize that what we're told about military operations often bears little resemblance to what actually happened, and to understand that the burial of inconvenient truths is sometimes as significant as the truths themselves. The story of Bradley refusing Patton wasn't just about strategic disagreements between two generals. It was about the systematic construction of a preferred historical narrative and the suppression of evidence that contradicted that narrative. And that's a story that deserves to be remembered as much as the battles themselves.